The outdoors are truly a crazy place. On this channel, we cover outdoors stories pretty often, whether it's a park ranger, a hunter, a hiker, or something else. We do it all here. In this video, I'm going to be covering some of the creepiest stories I've read in the outdoors, voted in by you guys on Twitter. If you guys want to vote for a future compilation, be sure to follow me at iSwampDweller on Twitter. You can find the information to do that in the description. This was 1998 when this happened. An old friend of mine asked me to go camping with him. I hadn't been since I was about 12, so I agreed. It sounded fun, and I was excited all week leading up to the trip. I didn't get much sleep the night before because of it. He picked me up just after 5 a.m., and we drove the 100 miles to the park. I managed to get a bit of sleep on the ride, so I felt a little better when we arrived. Then, he dropped the bomb on me. We still had to walk another 2 hours to the campsite. I tried to talk him into choosing a closer one, but he swore I'd love the one we had when we made it. With a heavy heart, I followed him. The first half hour wasn't that bad, I guess. Most of it was downhill. However, as more time passed, I became sluggish. Halfway there, we took a short break, but were back on the trail before I knew it. The second leg was a lot more uphill. It wasn't long until I was dragging again, and not paying attention to where I was stepping. We arrived at a flat section, and I was relieved. My friend was in front, and somehow missed the trap, but I didn't. All I remember was that 1 second, I was clomping along and hitting the ground. The contact with the bottom of the hole jolted me awake, and the rush of adrenaline masked most of the pain. As I stood up, my right ankle buckled, and I dropped down onto a sharp stick jutting out below me. Apparently, there are several more stakes in the bottom of the hole, but they had been knocked over, thankfully. When I looked down, I saw the bone sticking out of my shin. Instinctively, I pulled the stick from my leg, and the pain made me even queasier than I already was. I looked up to get an idea of where I was, and only saw blue sky edged by trees. I figured the hole was only about 10 feet deep or more. It must have taken the idiots that dug it several days. I yelled up for my friend only to see his laughing face greet me over the edge. He didn't know the extent of my injuries at that moment, but when I told him, the laughing stopped and panic replaced it. I asked him what happened, and he told me it looked like some redneck poachers had dug up some type of bear trap and I'd fallen into it. I assumed he could simply reach down and pull me out, but that didn't work. So next, he attempted to reach me where I was with the tree limb. This worked at first, but when I tried to stand up, the pain was far too severe. I couldn't put any weight on my right leg. It was obvious I wasn't getting out of this hole without outside help. It was still early in the day, so I wasn't too concerned. I could hear my friend pacing around above me freaking out, so I called up to him in a calm voice and told him to get help. The ranger station was a little way, probably about an hour. He could easily get help and make it back with plenty of time before dark. Once he took off, I was left alone with nothing but the pain to occupy my time. By this time, it was now coming in waves, and accompanying nausea wasn't making it any better. Initially, I thought I could make a splint, but the moment I tried to tighten it down, I almost fainted. Leaving it alone seemed to be the best decision. I put my head between my knees and waited for the sick, dizzy feeling to pass. Eventually it did, and I tried to focus on other things. Singing worked for a while. That is until I started hearing thunder and noticed the sky above me getting darker by the minute. Getting a little wet wasn't going to kill me, right? Perhaps I should have considered my circumstances before saying that. The rain was relatively light at first, but within minutes it was coming down in sheets. I was okay until I began to notice the hole filling with water. That's when my panic began to rise. My feet were already submerged by the time I realized I was in trouble. I clawed my way up the wall until I was standing, at least the best I was able to, and started praying for it to stop. As the minutes passed, more of my body disappeared. After an hour, the storm began letting up and I could relax just a bit. The water level was only about halfway up to my shins, and I knew now, if it continued at that rate, I would be long gone before help arrived. Unfortunately, it was just a lull in the storm. Soon enough, the rain was sheeting down again. I tried to remain positive about the whole thing. I tried to take my mind off the pain in my leg. I tried to be upbeat, thinking back on funny jokes and movies. The next hour was the longest of my life. When help finally arrived, the rain had almost completely stopped. At the time the ropes pulled me out, the water was just below my belt. Thinking about drowning to death in that little hole, out in the middle of nowhere, still gives me the willies. Once I was out of the hole, the ride to the hospital felt like it went very fast. After a surgery where I acquired some screws and a few plates, I was allowed to go home. The next 8 weeks on crutches would drag by, but I was happy to be alive, broken leg or not. We never got to make up for the lost trip, but I have taken my kids out camping a few times in the years since. While it's on my mind, I might give my friend a ring. We haven't seen each other in a few years, and a camping trip may be the best way to catch up. I'll make sure to keep my eyes open this time, though. This is the story of my first and last camping experience. I was 16 at the time, and my family, my mother, sister, and brother, had made plans to go out camping with our aunt, uncle, and 2 cousins over the weekend. This was my family's first real camping trip, while my cousins, aunt, and uncle had gone camping dozens of times. Our first afternoon and evening out camping actually went quite well. I surprisingly had quite a bit of fun. It was later that night, maybe around 10:30 or so, my cousins, my sister, and myself were settling into our tent. We were lying in our makeshift bed when we heard footsteps circling around our tent. Slightly alarmed by this, we sat up and noticed that whoever was outside circling the tent was holding what we assumed to be a stick and tracing the tent as they circled it. At one point, my sister sticks her hand out and feels a leg through the tent's fabric. We knew it wasn't our mother, as she has a trach, and her breathing is very deep and distinct. It wasn't our brother, because he was only 5 at the time, and we heard a grown adult's footsteps. The weight behind them really let us know that it wasn't a child. Our cousins informed us that it was probably their dad, who always liked to play pranks, especially at nighttime. We decided to look out the small window of the tent, or flap, or whatever you really want to call it, I don't know. It gave us a great view of the whole campsite. We looked towards the road that was right by our site, and on the road with my aunt and uncle walking back from the restrooms. My cousins, sister, and I started to connect the dots. Whoever was outside circling our tent wasn't a member of our family. It was a complete stranger. And all that separated us from that individual was a tiny layer of fabric. As our uncle and aunt approached our campsite, we called for them to come over to our tent and told them what happened. Everything stopped after we talked to our aunt and uncle. We assumed the individual ran away when our aunt and uncle approached our campsite. My cousins and sister were still understandably freaked out about what had just happened. I, on the other hand, was so tired that I wasn't able to process what happened and how scary it actually was. The rest of the trip went seemingly well, and I enjoyed the rest of it as much as I possibly could. The worst part of it all is that nobody believed us. In fact, our aunt and uncle and mother made fun of us and told us that we were just being paranoid, as my cousin, sister, and I love everything creepy from conspiracy theories to urban legends. It still bothers me all this time later because I never found out who that individual was or what their intentions were. I also think what could have happened if our aunt and uncle didn't come when they did. It's not like we'd be able to defend ourselves, as we were just teenage girls. Ever since then, I've been turned off of camping, and I don't see myself going again in the future. This is a Floridian cryptid camping story. I don't know if I sent this in before, but just in case, I'm going to send it to you again. I have made sure to put in some effort to make sure that all of my friends that were with us verified the same details that I remember. Anyways, Back when I was in high school, sometime in 2016, my boyfriend asked me if I wanted to go camping with two of our friends. Their names were Gretchen, Cindy, and Daniel. I don't really like camping, but I love spending time with these three, and we would be graduating soon and moving on with our lives. So, during a Friday afternoon, we grabbed our favorite snacks from a 7-Eleven and drove to Claremont, as they used to have some cool woods. We set up our little campsite about 10 minutes from Gretchen's car and started playing Uno on a picnic blanket. Once it got dark, Daniel and I went into our tent, while Gretchen and Cindy went into theirs. I fell asleep relatively quickly because I was just beat from the day. I had a relatively strange dream where I was this creature roaming through the woods. It was like if you were watching through the view of a drone camera. I was moving very quickly until I saw the embers of a fire and started moving towards it. I realized it was our campsite, and I woke up in a cold sweat. I couldn't move, but I woke up Daniel and asked what was wrong. But I put my finger on his mouth and whispered, "I think there's something out there." We sat there just for a few minutes in silence when our tent's zipper started to come undone. I didn't look at it, but I could hear its raspy breathing. All of a sudden, there was a loud police siren that made this creature run off into the night. We got out of our tents and saw Gretchen and Cindy doing the same. As soon as we were in Gretchen's car, I asked what that thing was. This is what Cindy told me when I asked her to re-describe what she saw. It was tall, hunched over, black figure with the body of a sleek and slender figure, with the legs of a horse or maybe even a deer. Topping its body were the head of a human with antlers. She quickly grabbed her phone and played a police siren app she used to scare us. Whatever that creature was, it couldn't have been friendly, and I'm thankful Cindy scared it off. If anybody has any idea what this could be out in the woods of Florida, please let me know in the comments down below. This is not my story. This happened to my history teacher. He told this story to us once. We live in Anchorage, Alaska. Alaska is known for lots of nature and outdoor adventures. Many people like going hiking, kayaking, hunting, etc. My history teacher, Mr. C, decided to go camping by himself and his dog out in Talkeetna, which is probably about 3 hours away from the city. This area is well known for hunting. Mr. C finds a nice spot, and he decided to camp close to his truck. During the day, he played with his dog and did what most campers do: relax. It started to get dark, and he decided to get to bed. He had one person in his tent, which was himself, and his dog slept with him. Mr. C did have a knife and a gun with him. Toward the middle of the night, his dog kept whining. He figured his dog needed to use the restroom and unzipped his tent. Mr. C said his dog immediately dashed out into the woods. He thought this was a bit weird. He left the tent unzipped so his dog could come back inside. Mr. C is still laying there awake and suddenly begins to hear what sounds like someone walking towards his tent. He's silent and waits. He grips his weapon and stares at the open entrance and sees this strange human-shaped creature. He said it walked like a gorilla, but it was skinny, bony, and seemed to have no texture to its body. Mr. C froze in fear. He mentioned it was so dark he couldn't even see what it looked like, only its shape. Mr. C said it crept toward the tent entrance and just sat there. It just watched him lay there for 2 hours. It was sitting at the entrance of his tent. Mr. C didn't want to move. He had nowhere to go since this thing was blocking his way. He stared at it for the duration that it watched him sleep. It didn't move. It didn't budge. It didn't even fidget around as an animal would. At this point, he's wondering where his dog is and realizes this is probably why his dog left. After a while, he heard his dog running back and barking in the background, and the strange creature jumped so fast and so high, he didn't even catch him to see where it ran off to. His dog came back to the tent, and Mr. C got the hell out of there in the morning. He said he'd never go back, and I don't blame him. I'm not really sure who came up with the idea first, but by day's end, we'd planned the destination and date. Although I'd been camping many times before, I'm almost positive neither Chuck or Glenn ever had. They had come into the family late in life, and my real dad had already died by then. He had been the guy who loved camping. My stepfather, not so much. Don't get me wrong, he's a great man, but the outdoors had never been his deal. The list of supplies needed for the trip was compiled and followed to the letter, including the 4 cases of beer. Perhaps the most important of all goods. We loaded up and been ready to leave at dawn the next morning. As we headed out, we had no idea of what lay ahead of us and how it would affect our connection to one another, a connection we once believed to be unbreakable. The 3-hour drive was uneventful and quiet. I was pleased to see how dry the surroundings were. Fire starting, while not hard for me, was not my strong suit, and I knew neither of my brothers had ever burned more than a cigarette. I brought along some lighter fluid just to be safe, although I never ended up needing it. While I worked on the fire, Chuck and Glenn set up the tent using knowledge they had learned watching YouTube videos. I had purposely got the easiest tent that I could find, yet it still took the better part of an hour before they had it up. The fire was already roaring by the time they joined me. I had buried the potatoes in the coals, prepared the steaks to be cooked, and was well into my second beer by then. The steaks didn't take long, and by dark, we were sitting down to a delicious meal. After dinner, the real camping began. I had chosen to camp out in the middle of nowhere on purpose. I knew we'd be more obnoxious and loud when we got drunk. More importantly, I like to make big bonfires and turn my music up loud. You can't do that with others around you. That evening turned out to be a blast. We blew through 2 cases and didn't pass out until dawn. It was something I needed to do for a long time. Despite the hangover, I resolved then and there, it was something we were going to do much more often. While I finally drugged myself from my sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Chuck and Glenn were already awake, sitting next to a cold fire. They both had a beer in their hand and looked happy to see me. I asked them what was up at the fire, and Chuck mumbled something about not being able to get it relit. That made me chuckle. I walked over to the tree line and grabbed a handful of wood. When I returned, I sat down with the dead coals and blew onto them. The coals lit up brightly and the fire was roaring again within a few minutes. Then I went to the creek to fetch some water. The look on their face was priceless. Chuck's jaw was hanging open and I could tell Glenn was aching to ask me how I did it. While I waited for the water to boil, I cooked up a large mess of eggs and potatoes, and we ate breakfast with a cup of coffee. Once I had eaten, I was feeling much better and suggested we go fishing. We didn't make it back to the camp until almost dark. Unfortunately, no one had caught anything. Nothing we could keep anyway, but I could tell Chuck had already caught a good buzz. I cooked what was left of the steak, and after we set to finishing what was left of the beer. This evening was much tamer than the one before. I didn't want to make a big fire, it would only be harder for me to put it out completely before we left for home. Most of the night, the 3 of us talked about unimportant things like girls and work. Around 2 in the morning though, we decided to turn in, the beer long being drunk. My last memory was Chuck going to take a leak. He had drunk a lot more than Glenn or I. He fell several times trying to get out of his sleeping bag, but eventually made it out of the tent. I must have passed out just after that. The next thing I remember, the sun was already beginning to shine through the trees. I had to pee like crazy, so I fumbled my way to the zipper, trying not to wake the other 2 guys up. As I unzipped the tent, a weird burning smell similar to burned meat hit me. I figured one of the guys had already been up making breakfast. I looked behind me and Glenn was still asleep. Chuck must have been the one cooking, and he was terrible at it. I crawled out with a smirk on my face and a smart remark to him. I looked up, expecting to see my brother burning food, but what I was met with was a sight for serious horror. I never imagined I would see something like this. The fire was burned out and Chuck was nowhere to be seen. The dawn was still too dim to make out the large object laying across the dead coals. I walked up within a few steps and was hit fully by the burning smell. Then, all of a sudden it hit me, what I was seeing. Chuck was laying face down across one corner of the cold fire, and he wasn't moving. Without a second thought, I grabbed his body and rolled it over. All I could see was black and smell the terrible burning. I began yelling for Glenn, and when he didn't answer immediately, I ran to the tent and shook him. He was reluctant at first, but when I yelled, "Chuck's f***ing dead!" loudly in his face, he jolted upright and asked me to repeat it. All I could do was point towards the remnants of the fire and the horrible vision that the sun was making clearer by the minute. He flew from the tent in one quick motion and came almost face to face with the charred body of our dead brother. I stood behind him, and silently, with my eyes closed, Glenn fell to his knees and started wailing. At that second, I wanted to be anywhere but there. The sound of Glenn's haunting wails and the horrid smell permeating the air was worse than any nightmare I have ever imagined. A cold breeze was blowing across me, and that was when it became clear that I peed myself. It didn't matter though. With every second the sight became clearer, and I was terrified to open my eyes. This was not the way I wanted to remember Chuck. I eventually crawled back into the tent and started crying myself. This continued for God knows how long, until I figured I should call 911 and let them know what happened. They arrived about half an hour later. When the coroner left with his body, I summoned the courage to come out. Glenn was speaking to some of the officers. The smell was still so bad. I began retching and retreated back into the tent. Soon after, another officer joined me inside the tent, and we talked about the trip and events of the night before. Nothing in particular. He left about 20 minutes later with the remaining officers. I began breaking down camp, and Glenn soon joined me. As we worked, nothing was said between us. I moved as fast as possible, hoping to soon be away from this awful place. Looking back now, I acknowledge I probably was a bit cold and uncaring. In my defense, I was the oldest and had the responsibility of notifying the rest of my family. I knew her mother was going to be crushed, and I wanted to tell her before she heard it from the news. When it comes to Glenn, I can't speak for how he was feeling or what he was thinking. No one has the right to dictate the other's feelings, you know? How to handle their grief, especially in a circumstance such as this. Telling Mom was really bad. She always wanted a large family. When Dad died, she thought her dream was over. However, when she met my stepfather and he mentioned adoption, she was overjoyed. Chuck and Glenn were actual brothers, about 2 years apart, and in their early teens, when Mom found them, boys their age were usually hard to adopt out. But Mom had fallen in love with them. I always considered them my blood, as did the rest of my family. Glenn and I stayed close to her for some time, knowing how hard Chuck's loss was. This was the first instance of where I began feeling Glenn harbored suspicions toward me. Nothing was said, but I caught him watching me with his unusual questioning look. Many times throughout that month, as the months passed more and more, questions began to be raised, many more than I care to mention. I had always assumed Chuck had passed out or tripped or fell into the fire, killing him. He had been much drunker than us. However, when the results came back from the medical examiner, certain things were off. The bruises, for instance, Chuck's back was covered in them. The thing was, Chuck played rugby with some guys from school and had for many years. Also, his skull was fractured, a worrying sign for sure. But even the doctor was forced to admit things like this happen in fire. The skull bursts or cracks from the heat. Horrible facts to hear, I agree, but for some reason they have cemented the suspicions in Glenn's mind. No matter how hard I try to show him this was the wrong time to be a part of some sort of conspiracy theory, he convinced himself I had something to do with our brother's death. I've had my own reservations toward Glenn and his relationship with Chuck. More than once. I saw them argue about something, but they stopped whenever I entered the room. Do I have my own suspicions? Yes. But now is not the time to fracture the family. Our mother needs us more than ever, right now. If she became aware of the distrust between us, it would not only break my heart, but it may just kill her. For the unforeseeable future, I'm going to do my best to bring us back together. If not for my mom's sake, perhaps Chuck's. On my own, I'm going to keep digging into the rift between the two brothers, and if it led to Chuck's death, even if it yields some terrible truth that I may not want to be aware of, I owe it to him. After all, Chuck was my brother too. I grew up in some mountains of Kentucky. My birthday falls on the first day of open season. Being raised by a male, I would always go hunting for my birthday, even though it's a guy's sport, as many say. For my 13th birthday, my father gave me a pink 30-06. I was so excited and wanted to take it out. My father and I, the next morning at about 4:30 in the morning, all decked out in our hunting gear, decided to grab our stuff alongside our walking sticks and hike up the mountain to our stands. Being 13, my father allowed me to be in my own stand at the time, as he was not much farther than probably 30 yards away. Our hunting stands were in a tree, more like a treehouse than a hunting stand. I got in my stand and set up my area. When my father got to his stand, he texted me to let me know that all was clear. After probably no more than an hour of not seeing much of anything, I saw something. It was the biggest buck I think I have ever seen. I took my aim and shot. If you have never been hunting, many times when you shoot, the animal will run off, so you have to follow the blood and footprints until you come across the body. For the record, I'm a pretty damn good shot, as I was taught how to shoot by a US Marine. I shot this buck, but rather than going down or running off, it screamed, sounding like a high-pitched, unearthly scream. Then the buck, or whatever this thing was, began to run off. I quickly brushed off the scream as a mountain lion, as they make the same noise. I scrambled down from the stand and run to the spot where this thing was standing. My father ran up behind me and commented on that mountain lion that must be close, saying we need to get that deer quick before the cat does. We see blood drops and chase it until we are in a clearing where the blood just seemingly stops. There is nobody or any footprints anywhere. This is absolutely astonishing. We decided that we would go back to the stands and continue hunting. Fast forward to that night, my father worked on a night shift, and he was a single parent of 5 kids. At night, we would sleep at my grandparents' house when he had to work. My grandparents' house was on the top of a steep hill, and at the bottom of the hill, there was a pretty dense forest. I went to sleep but was awoken by some kind of high-pitched scream, very similar to what I had heard earlier. I go to the window and see this buck standing in my grandparents' yard. I remember a sense of dread and darkness as this thing looked at me and stood on its hind legs. I ran back to my bed and laid down. I heard it scream at least 3 more times that night. My grandfather rushed into my room and I pointed at the window. He said it was running with ease down this very steep hill, on its hind legs. My grandfather, being Native American, has heard legends of these skinwalkers and did cleansing rituals on the land. I never saw this thing again, but that scream, it haunts me, even to this very day. My grandfather was an absolute badass guy. He was born somewhere in Alberta during the early 30s and raised his 3 brothers on a reservation from the time he was 9. When his parents left for BC with their only daughter, they promised to return, and none of the boys ever saw them again. To make ends meet, he learned carpentry and worked as a laborer and bare-knuckle boxed against older men for extra cash. He learned how to track and hunt, and always came home with something to eat when work was scarce. When he was 14, he put the second oldest brother in charge of the household, left the reservation in search of his parents and a better life, and never went back. That was the last time he saw any of his family members. He spent several months riding the rails, befriending some transients, while using his fighting skills to defend himself against others. He eventually made his way to Vancouver, the last known whereabouts of his parents and sister, and started working in a pulp mill. At 17 years old, he eventually met my grandmother, and the two eventually married, leading to him giving up his search for his family. They bought some land, and he spent his free time building several houses, which will stand to this day. One of those sat on the land he bought with my grandmother, which included acres of wooded area. On this land, my grandparents kept dogs, horses, and small farm animals for eggs and meat. My aunt was born in the early 50s, and then my mother came along right before the end of the decade. As far as I have heard, nothing bad or really strange happened until my mom found an old Ouija board and played it by herself. But I don't know if that has anything to do with this story. My mother was around 8 when she was riding her horse through the wooded part of their acreage when the horse stopped dead in its tracks. My mom tried to spur it on, but it was frozen in fear, and all of a sudden, she smelled something like rotting garbage or meat. She pulled back on the reins and the horse instantly turned and took back off toward the house, almost knocking her off its back several times along the way. Afterward, the horse was never the same. It would try to kick her, and if she got on it, it would fall backward, trying to crush her beneath it. Once, it started acting like its old self again, letting her climb onto it, but once she did, it ran towards the road and stopped abruptly, bucking her forward into the path of an oncoming car. My grandpa saw it and put a shotgun to its head, and the horse just kept breathing heavily and stared straight ahead. My mother barely missed being run over by a car that saw the horse coming and managed to swerve out of the way, and my grandmother begged my grandfather not to shoot the horse. He finally decided to give it away when he saw my mother wasn't badly injured. The horse fell on the next person to ride it, breaking her collarbone, and the father did what my grandpa said he should have done in the first place. After that, animals started going missing, and one of the hunting dogs was injured by something during an attack at night. My grandfather sent out some hunting traps and stayed in the hayloft above the barn with a shotgun and rifle beside him. He slept out there for several nights, hunting whatever was out there. He figured it was foxes or maybe coyotes or wolves, or even a desperate bear, which is what he attributed the smell in the woods to, and the horse's reason for losing its mind. But nothing came the entire time he slept out there, and eventually, he figured it had moved on to easier prey, or maybe even died. The day he stopped sleeping in the barn, my mom was out near the tree line playing with the injured dog as it was healing. Out of nowhere, the dog started sniffing the air, then positioned itself between my mom and the trees, growling and barking. My grandpa heard the noise and came out, stopped in his tracks, and called back to my grandmother to bring his rifle, then whistled for the dogs. My grandma came out, handed him his gun, and then asked what was going on. As the dogs all started to react like the first one, my grandfather pointed to one of the treetops, which looked longer and thicker than those around it, but it was very slightly moving. It was at least 6 feet tall, he told me later when he would retell the story, but probably a good bit taller. He took aim and fired just as he saw a pair of wings start to open up. Whatever was up there was watching them, but he beat it to the punch. It was a kill shot, directly in the chest with a high-powered rifle. He instantly started running towards it, with all the dogs following him as the thing plummeted to the ground, the breaking of tree branches wholly unmistakable. When he reached the impact point, he raised his rifle again and commanded the dogs forward to flush it out, but they all just stood in the spot and kept spinning around, trying to catch a scent that seemingly disappeared. A pile of broken branches lay on the ground in an obvious landing spot, but beyond that there was no proof that anything had ever happened. No body, no blood, no trail, nothing at all. It was like this thing had either disappeared or gone straight back up the way it came. He searched those woods for several days but never found a sign of what that thing was or what it ever could have been. They didn't see it or experience issues with the animals ever after that. Decades later, when he was dying, he kept talking about how he saw something. In his delirium, he referred to it as an alien but said it was coming back for him. I've never seen that man scared of anything in my life, but there was actual panic and fear in his voice. A few nights before he died, he had already been too weak to stand on his own for several days, and my grandmother awoke to the sound of a gunshot. She ran outside fearing the worst and saw my grandpa lowering his rifle, staring at something in the distance. She took the gun away and helped him back inside, and that was that. I don't know if whatever it was actually did come back for him, or if it was a hallucination of an old memory, but I like to think he went out with a final FU to the thing that tried to torment his family all those years ago. Allow me to begin with a little bit of background without doxing myself too much. I live in the westmost region of Appalachia, pretty far out in the sticks. Save for a few sparse neighbors consisting of farms, I'm surrounded by pretty much nothing but woodland. For the past few weeks, I've been spending a lot of time in the forge, as the marching band season begins shortly, and I want to get as much work done as I can before then, when my shop time will be limited. As such, I work most days into the night. My shop consists of a garage connected to the barn. It's about 50 by 20 feet, open on both sides. It may have been a trick of the light, but lately I think I've been seeing dark shapes moving around the trees. Not human exactly, but also not entirely animal, but very similar. It's moving quickly, and then stops periodically, with no discernible features due to the darkness. I could see no eyes, and they made no sound save for a strange call I heard one night while feeding the chickens. It sounded almost like a whale song, but less echoey and short. I at first thought it was maybe a variety of foxes or something, but upon observing the tree line, the strange shapes were moving among the pines were substantially larger than any fox I had ever knew. I did not sleep well that night. I kept having nightmares and would wake up in cold sweats. It was at that point that I decided I could no longer allow the creatures, whatever they may be, to remain unknown any longer. I had to figure out what they were. I surmised that the following night I would turn all the lights on in the shop, as it would appear that I was inside at work, and, like hunting wild boar, don my ghillie suit and wait in the trees for them to appear. Yes, I was literally hunting shadows. This may have been chalked up to my foolish overestimation in my own steel, which would be tested the following night under the moonless. I worked the day, glancing into the woods periodically, observing only trees swaying in the cool winds. As night fell, and I left the shop dressed as a stand of foliage, and perhaps underarmed, I only had thought to bring my .22 Ruger Mk3, fitted with a matching suppressor. It looked cool, and thus to me was more enticing to bring into the forest than a more powerful .38 or even a .45. But there was also the problem of over-penetration and the noise that would surely wake my sleeping folks. But the suppressed Ruger loaded with subsonic rounds did not surpass the sound of one speaking. I had also considered that the figures were perhaps a herd of cows or horses that has broken loose of a neighboring farm. But the way they moved was just not familiar to me. They almost seemed to glide over the underbrush like a wolf in flight, not like a cow or a horse. It would pick its way carefully through the foliage, and it would undoubtedly make noise. I waited almost half an hour before I noticed a shape, unmoving, 30 yards away from where I sat crouched. I found this unusual, as there were always more when I observed them from the shop. I scanned my surroundings, remembering scenes of It's Right Behind You from slasher films. I turned back to the figure, which seemed to be moving away from me. So at that point I gave chase. Navigating the area was not too difficult as I knew it well, but the ghillie suit constantly caught on the brush as I ran, and to compound that, it was beginning to rain lightly, dampening my clothing and sending shivers down my spine. After just a few more minutes, I burst out into a clearing near the house with hills rising to the east, lowlands to the south, and the house perhaps a half-mile to my west. My watch has a compass on it. I stared into the tree line surrounding me, but to no avail. Whatever it was nowhere to be seen. I decided to rest there, leaning on a tree, staring into the clearing, still on the hunt for whatever this thing was. The stars were bright. I got up after a while, slightly disappointed in my failure to hunt and catch whatever this thing is, and turned to walk home and retire. But, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a frame between the trees of the lowland, leading to the creek. There were 5, perhaps more, shapes standing still. I can't explain how, but it felt as if they were staring at me. I did not raise my weapon. Walking closer, I could make out definitive shapes. They looked to be canine, like very big dogs or wolves, which was rare to see this far south. I was about 20 yards away from them now. As I approached, it became clear that they were not wolves or anything of the sort. They were not like any animal I have ever encountered or hunted in my entire life. Something about the encounter felt viscerally wrong. They began to approach me, and that's when I began to realize that ghostly apparitions or not, I was utterly alone with 5 or possibly even more large creatures with only a small caliber pistol and a hunting knife to defend myself. Pangs of panic gripped me. I took a few steps backwards and began to run, breaking into a sprint, pausing to squeeze off 5 shots at 50 yards away, hitting nothing. But as I broke the wood line, I glanced back and saw nothing of the creatures that stood before me moments before. After a few minutes, I burst from the trees, damp and panting from the labor of sprinting with a wet ghillie suit through the thick brush. I collapsed onto the chair in my shop and stripped the suit off, sitting there wet and tired in my underwear. The next day I was advised by a friend with which I had consulted to burn sage in the vicinity. So I did, and I have never seen whatever this thing was, ever again. I have no idea what it was. I've looked up things, and I just can't seem to find anything that matches up. If anybody in the comments has any idea what this could be, please let me know. This story isn't really paranormal, but it's the only thing in my life that still haunts me. I was about 20 years old at the time that this happened. I was out hunting with my dad and our dogs. We were just strolling along this path when one of the dogs starts barking its head off. It was freaking out about something up ahead, and we assumed it had found us a moose. The dog's barking came closer, and with it, heavy steps. We realized the dog was being chased by something. At first we weren't worried though. Just the sight of humans is usually enough to scare off whatever. But we were still ready to protect ourselves if need be. It wasn't an elk or anything we'd seen around here for a long time. It was a big, fat mama brown bear charging for the dog. I assume mama because no bear in its right mind except for a mom with cubs will go after humans usually. As it was my dog, it came straight for me. We started shouting and making ourselves big, but it didn't stop this thing from ramming into me. It started mauling me. If you're wondering, backing away slowly isn't going to stop a charging bear from attacking. Too late for that now though. So we did what instinct said. I only remember the heavy pressure on my chest and the dog barking until my dad got in a good shot, which sent the bear running back from where it came. I got scratched up all over my chest and had a few broken ribs, but if my dad wouldn't have been there, I would have been dead for sure. I still feel a little worried when I go out hunting, but I love the lifestyle so much that I don't think I could ever honestly quit. Besides, my pup's learned its lesson since then, and I don't think he'll be messing with any bears ever again. I can't be the only one who grew up in a small town with a few resident creeps. I'm not talking about criminals or stalkers though. I'm talking about those people who live in the house on the hill or at the end of the street. The people that everyone knows of, but nobody actually knows, if you know what I mean. Everyone else in town seems to agree that there's something not quite right about them, and they never have visitors. I'm sure every single one of you listening knows the type. When I was a little kid, I spent a lot of my time with my grandparents on their farm in the foothills of North Carolina. I would explore all around their property, and most of the neighbors would let me explore their land too. However, there was one man who lived a few miles from the farm my grandparents warned me about that I should never go near. The neighbors all agreed something about him was a little bit off. The exact reason people cited were varied, ranging from PTSD to an escape from a mental asylum, but nobody could say for sure exactly what his problem actually was. I always followed my grandparents' advice, and I never knocked on the door of the elegant, two-story farmhouse where the mysterious man lived, but I nevertheless found myself standing in front of that old farmhouse back in November of last year. Now, I'm a machinist by trade, but sometimes I work odd jobs on the side for some extra cash. I often do jobs using heavy machinery, mostly grading driveways or digging drainage ditches, so when I got called asking what my rate would be for removing about a dozen large tree stumps, I was excited at the prospect of an extra payday. However, when I arrived at the given address, I was more than a little bit surprised to find that it was the oh-so-familiar home of the mystery man from my childhood. I slowly rolled up the long gravel driveway, suddenly trepidatious about the meeting of a man that I had been so advised to avoid. Finally, though, I reasoned with myself that surely the resident must simply be an old shut-in, and I scolded myself for being such an irrational, guy. I'm sure he's probably a good customer based on childhood gossip. I can't paint him as a bad guy just yet. I knocked on the sturdy door of the farmhouse, and after just a few moments, the door swung open to reveal an elderly gentleman, probably 80 or so. I introduced myself, and he hobbled shakily out of the house to show me the stumps that needed to be removed. I gave him my estimate for the cost, and he slowly nodded, saying, that'll be fine. When can you start? The sooner the better. We shook hands on a date and price, and as I got back in my truck to leave, I thought to myself that he seemed far less scary than all the rumors might suggest. Maybe it was because he was a much older man now. Although, as I looked over my shoulder, going back down the driveway, a flash of movement from the tree line caught my eye. It was only there for a split second, but I could have sworn, I was pretty sure, I saw a person's face staring at me from behind one of the trees on the edge of the yard. I had always been told the man lived alone, but I figured it wasn't really that odd for someone to be visiting, right? Maybe it was an out-of-town grandchild exploring the woods just like I would have done as a kid. Anyway, I returned just a few days later, and the stubborn walnut stubs proved no match for my old D7. Once I was done, I knocked on the door and informed the owner I had finished early and would be billing him for fewer hours of work than anticipated. He smiled dryly and thanked me for my honesty, offering to pay me extra for finishing the job so quickly. I initially assured him that it was really no big deal, but then he made me a very tempting offer. He asked if I would like to come and hunt on his land. Since it was the height of deer season at the moment, I was certainly interested,
since his entire 250-acre property was ringed with barbed wire fences and no trespassing signs. In fact, everybody I knew avoided the place due to the rumors and stigma surrounding the owner, and that meant I would probably have a chance at some pretty gnarly deer. I eagerly accepted and thanked him for the opportunity, and as soon as I had a free weekend, I headed out over to his land. Nearly the entire property was covered in dense woods and pine thickets, so this wouldn't be the usual post up in a tree stand and wait sort of hunt. No, this would be a real, old-school deer stalking. It couldn't have been more than 40 degrees that day, and to make things worse, it was misting rain. It was great weather for hunting, but it certainly made me grateful for my thick clothing and warm socks. I followed a tangle of game trails through the thick woods, and I saw plenty of deer tracks, even a few really large ones, all leading deeper and deeper into the pines and cedars. I should also mention that the woods were incredibly calm and peaceful, since the gloom and chill of the rainy November day had practically put the entire forest to sleep. In fact, other than the occasional rustle of a small animal dashing through the damp underbrush, the only noises were my own footsteps and the soft patter of rain. The rest of the day passed in much the same way, but by 5:15 it was starting to get dark. So I decided to turn around and start to make my way back to my truck. Luckily, the rain had mostly stopped, but a thick fog now hung in the damp evening air. I carefully retraced my steps as the woods became darker and darker and more unfamiliar. However, just when I was about to pull out my flashlight, I noticed that mine were no longer the only footsteps in the twilight thicket. I stood very still, listening to the movement in the brush as it drew closer. The footfalls were too loud to be deer, and besides, even a herd of deer are careful and methodical as they move, pausing regularly and picking their way around any obstacle. By contrast, these footsteps were reckless and constant, and I could hear twigs and low-hanging limbs cracking. This, I realized, is the sound of a human traipsing through the woods. I quietly crouched and hunkered down behind the base of a large poplar tree. Making myself small in its shadow, I was worried that whoever was coming might be a poacher, and certainly didn't want to catch a bullet due to being mistaken for an animal in the murky darkness. As the footsteps grew closer, I realized there was definitely more than one other person out there in the fog. And even worse, I couldn't tell exactly what direction they were coming from or headed in. I could hear voices too, at least 2, maybe 3, but they sounded very muffled and distorted in the thick mist. I held my breath as I listened closely, and I leaned out from behind the tree just enough to look in the general direction of the noise. There, probably no more than 20 yards away, was the soft glow of an old incandescent flashlight. Bobbing through the fog and silhouetted in the light, I could see 3 nightmarish figures. At first, I couldn't even make any sense of what I was seeing. The 3 silhouettes looked like aliens. They were so bizarre. Each one of them had an amalgamation of human and animal features. However, on closer inspection, I realized that the mysterious shapes were actually people. Strange people wearing what I think were skulls or masks. The one in the front was definitely wearing a deer skull and antlers on top of his head, as well as a hooded cloak that was made from crudely cut animal skin. It also carried what looked like a shovel over its shoulder, and in its other hand, it held a flashlight responsible for the glow. The second and third figures stood close together, and they both wore a collection of coyote tails like bandoliers across their bodies, along with coyote skulls adorning their hoods. As I squinted and I looked more closely, I could see that they were carrying something between them. It looked like a large tarp or a sack, and judging by how the 2 coyote men handled it, it must have been heavy. As I watched the Surreal column move wordlessly through the undergrowth, there was suddenly a loud rustling in the brush behind me. I snapped around to bring my rifle to bear, but when I turned to face the noise, I saw that it was only a fat possum. The little thing just stared at me for a few moments before dashing away back through the woods. But I guess the noise of its passing had gotten the attention of the 3 animal men, because when I looked back around, the 3 of them and the one with the deer antlers had turned back and begun to walk in my direction. I held my breath and made myself as small as possible behind the poplar tree, and I silently flipped my rifle safety off. The deer man drew closer and closer, and the ground on either side of my hiding place was bathed in the yellow glow of the flashlight. My blood thrummed in my ears as my heart beat faster and faster. I didn't know for sure that these people would be hostile, but I wasn't about to pop out and introduce myself all the same. The footsteps of the deer man were very close now, and if I listened carefully, I could make out the sounds of breathing on the other side of the tree. However, just when I was for sure thinking he was about to come around the tree, I heard one of the Coyote men call out in the distance. I couldn't tell quite what he said, but I could make out the word heavy, so I assumed he was complaining about whatever he was carrying. The light suddenly disappeared as it was pointed back in the other direction, and the footsteps began to recede into the distance. I must have waited a good 5 or 10 minutes before getting up from my hiding place. I was completely unsure of whether or not the bizarre trio had actually left or not, but when I poked my head back around the tree, they were definitely gone and out of sight. I wanted nothing more than to get the heck out of there as fast as I could, but I couldn't help going and having a quick look at where they had passed. It didn't take me long to locate their footprints, and much to my relief, maybe, humorously, all 3 sets I found were normal shoe prints. No giant hooves or paws. However, as I shone my flashlight on the ground and investigated the footprints, something else caught my eye. Right in the middle of the trail, the 3 of them had left, there was a glistening splotch of red-brown liquid that could be anything. But I'm pretty sure it was blood. I shined my flashlight further down the trail, and sure enough there were more drops and splotches of this dark liquid everywhere. Further still, there was a large puddle where the Coyote man had to stop earlier. Feeling nauseous, I realized the implications of what I may have seen, and I quickly doused my flashlight to avoid broadcasting my presence. Now filled with a rising panic, I got moving as fast as I could to the trailhead, as quietly as possible. The rain had started again, and in the foggy darkness I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I still only pulled my flashlight out when I absolutely had to, in case those people were still prowling around. Finally, eventually, probably around maybe 7:45, I finally stumbled out of the woods. I hastily jumped in my truck and pulled back onto the road. I was pretty focused on getting out of there, but as I drove past the farmhouse I did notice that the lights were on. There were no other cars in the driveway though, so whoever I'd seen in the woods hadn't come by that route. Once I was home safely, I called the sheriff's office and anonymously reported that I had seen some suspicious men in those woods. I didn't mention the animal skin cloaks or the various pelts and skulls. I don't know if there was ever an investigation into this, but nothing ever showed up about it in the local paper. As far as I know, no bodies were ever found and no arrests were ever made, but I can tell you for certain that there are places in those woods where something can hide and never be found. For the rest of the season I didn't go back there, and I'm not sure the old man's offer was good for more than one season. Even if I got the chance, I don't think I would go back out there alone. However, at least now I understand all those warnings from my childhood. I don't think all of the neighbors were really that concerned about the old shut-in. I think they knew about those people using the land for God knows what, and they wanted to keep me and all the other kids out from that area to keep us safe.
Out in the parks of Montana, we've had people go missing in my time working with the park rangers. My name is Nate, and I'm going to tell you about these mysterious disappearances. I don't have any way to know how or why they are missing. I can only say that they are missing, and it is rather strange due to the circumstances. I'm going to keep this somewhat short, but these people all seem to go missing from the same area of our park. We aren't sure if they are being snatched up or sold or what's going on, but there are some bad dealings that happen in this area from time to time. We also can't rule out the possibility that maybe they're simply running away. In fact, we've never figured out anything in relation to these cases as there seems to be nothing to go on. The earliest one I can remember was a 7-year-old girl who went missing with her family. They went into the park and never came out again. I remember the girl simply because she was a child, and as a dad myself, that makes things like these hit a bit differently. Police and our park ranger services certainly looked for this family, but it's as though they went into the woods and then just disappeared. The second disappearance was a college-age couple. Just like the family a few years before them, they went into the woods and never came out again. There are a few people who claim they believe there's a cult operating out in the area, but we've never seen anything that could verify that theory. I know stranger things happen, but it's a bit unnerving to think people could just disappear like that. I often find myself pondering what happens to people who go missing, not just in our area, but in general. The third disappearance happened late at night in 2010, I believe, if memory serves me correctly, and it was a rather fit man in his 40s who went into the woods and did not come out again. Now, some witnesses in the area at the time did say they heard someone shouting for help, and they went into the woods towards the sounds of the voice, but eventually, the voice faded, and they never found anyone. They were the people who reported the man missing before his family came forward. The final disappearance, and probably the most disturbing sounding one, involved a woman in her 30s who went out late one night much like the man who previously disappeared. She was heard screaming. Another man went into the woods and said he felt shaken and uncomfortable. It was shortly after he found a flashlight that was later identified as having belonged to the missing woman. I believe something very dark is happening out there, but the problem is, where is any real evidence of what happened to the missing? I've debated going in on my off time looking over the area, but I've never worked up the nerve. I know this isn't a super disturbing story, as we have no way to actually know what happened to these individuals, but it is something I wanted to share, if for no other reason than as a warning to always be careful, even in state parks, if traveling off the beaten path, and even on the normal ones. I'm a park ranger out of Mississippi, and in the swampier areas we see gators. Now, most people realize there are gators out there, but I want to talk about something else. Something far larger. I'm talking about a ridiculously large gator out in the swamps of Mississippi. Now, I've been working with the rangers for a long time, but in my free time, I like to go swamping, as I like to call it. I like to explore the lovely nature of the swamp on my off time. I've seen many a gator out there, but one evening, I saw something I could not believe. And I guess I wouldn't have ever believed it myself if I hadn't seen it. And I understand if you don't believe it, as it really is something that you have to see. So, I'm boating around in the swamps when I hear something. I'm like, okay, it's probably a gator or something out that way. So I think nothing of it, and I just keep putting along, enjoying my evening. It isn't long before I see an opossum chilling out in a tree. Now, I pay little mind, other than to glance at it, when I suddenly feel something slam into the side of my boat, and it damn near flipped me off the thing. After settling, I look up and see this large gator chomp on the opossum. I have never seen anything like that. And the scariest part is after that happened, it submerged. Its tail straight up hit my boat. Keep in mind, it was already a few feet from my boat after slamming it, so it must have been massive. I remember starting my boat up and turning tail and getting the hell out of Dodge. I know it sounds silly. If you would have seen it though, you'd have turned white as a ghost. When I finally made it out of the swamp, I remember my legs shaking and having taken a moment to calm myself down. Since this happened, I haven't gone back into the swamp. No sir, I am a happy landman now. I'm not about to get chomped by some large gators that shouldn't exist. Nope, not at all. Anyway, I know this was on the shorter side, but I thought I'd give you all a heads up to be careful, cause them gators can get real big. And just for size reference, this gator easily was as big as Gustav if you've ever heard the legend of him. I know most people won't believe it, but this thing was massive. My name is Pamela, and back in 2003, I'm fairly certain I saw a legend walking our parks. We get a lot of animals around the area. It's a park. You expect that sort of thing. But on one particular evening, we had experienced something unexpected. It started with a rancher phoning us about livestock he'd lost. Apparently, one of his cattle had gone missing, and being it was near the area, he called to ask whether we'd seen it wandering around by chance. I answered the call and explained to him we had not seen any livestock in the area, but that we'd look around and be sure his cattle hadn't escaped onto the park somehow. I remember laughing at the thought, but still taking the matter seriously while on the line. After I hung up, I explained to my boss the situation, and he said we could go looking. It was a Friday, and we had time to kill before the end of the shift anyway. So he didn't see any harm in looking for a rogue cow. I remember how lighthearted everyone was about it, and how we were all making jokes. Well, time went on, and we found nothing. So we phoned the rancher and said we hadn't seen his cattle, but if we did, we'd contact him again. But if we didn't contact him, it meant we simply never saw any cattle. He thanked us for searching anyway, and said he'd call if his cattle turned up, so we weren't aimlessly looking forever. I remember going home and sleeping as I volunteered to work on Saturday. Well, Saturday morning comes around and I roll into work early. It was still dark out, and as I step out of my truck, I hear a loud mooing. I smiled and went over to where I heard the sound, and as I got closer to the mooing, it got more intense, I guess you could say. I was a little lost as to why that would be, but in order to make sure the cattle was okay, I figured I'd hurry up as the last thing I wanted to do was tell the rancher we found dead cattle at the park. As I approach, suddenly this cow comes rushing out and almost hits me. It slams into my truck and falls over, and I'm about to go over and try to calm it down when something darts by me really fast. This thing leaps faster and sinks its teeth into the cow. I'm all sorts of lost, but I rush over. To my horror, this thing turns around and sort of hisses at me, if you can call it that. It is very hard to describe the sound, but this thing looked like a weird cat or dog. Hard to say. Mixed with a rat. It was kind of small. It took me a second before it hit me that what this thing was, or at least I believed it to be. This was a chupacabra. I know how crazy that sounds, and you can laugh all you want. I'm 99.9% positive that is what this thing was. To wrap this up, and not drone on, the thing darted off into the woods shortly after this, and I never saw or heard from it ever again. I called to the rancher who came by and picked up his cow. The cow had lost some blood, but it was overall fine, and it lived. I didn't know what to say about the thing, the bite marks and everything. I just told the rancher what I saw. They seemed concerned, but they didn't seem to think I was crazy. I guess they were strong believers in such things themselves as they grew up with urban legends. After the weekend came to an end, I talked to my boss about it and he simply laughed. He said he's sure I saw something, but he wasn't convinced it was a chupacabra. He can say what he wishes, but I'm positive I saw this thing, and I'm certain that it does exist. My name is Donnie and I worked with park services in Utah for 20 years before retiring. One of the weirdest things I've ever come across is a kid. Now, I know what you're going to think, and I know you're going to say that this is weird, but I can tell you now, this is no normal happening. It was the summer of '94, when I met a kid that would play in our park. When I first met her, I asked if she had any parents around, as I was concerned about her wandering around aimlessly, even if our parks were well monitored and generally safe. When I'd do this, she would say they didn't live far away, and she was headed home shortly anyway. In the '90s though, stranger danger was becoming a thing. It wasn't entirely unheard of for kids to go around the neighborhood and play or hang out, even in parks. Generally though, if this was happening there, was either a parent or somebody nearby. At the very least, there was a large group of kids, and this girl looked like she was no older than 7. Anyway, the first time she left when I offered to phone her home. The second time, though, she seemed a bit more distraught. She kept saying she was looking for her dog, which she called Macy. She said it was a golden retriever, and that it had gotten out of their yard and run off toward the park. I offered to help find her dog, so long as she stuck with me. I also asked her if her parents knew that she was out here. She said no. As this happened when she was playing in the backyard, she was worried she could be in trouble if her parents found out. This seemed a normal concern for a child, but in an effort to be sure she was in a safe living situation, I asked her if her parents were nice. She told me yes, they were very loving, and they treated her like a princess. I remember the smile on her face, and I felt reassurance at this. I asked if once we found Macy, I could walk her back to meet her parents. She agreed, but seemed hurried as she was fixated on finding her dog. We spent a large part of the day searching for Macy, but eventually gave up. This girl told me she wanted to go home and talk to her parents, so I of course obliged and walked her to her house. It was around the time we were getting closer, as she put it, that I grew a bit concerned. The only thing down the way we were headed, to my knowledge, was an old farmhouse, well out of the way, and as far as I know, no one lived there. I asked the girl what her name was, because she had never given it to me. She said that her name was Kaylee. I then asked her where she lived. She told me on the farm. I asked her if she'd moved there recently, to which she replied she lived here her whole life. I didn't want to doubt the girl, but I felt a hesitation growing within me. The more she told me about herself, I tried to shrug this off and decided I'd take her the rest of the way home. When we arrived at home, there was only the farmhouse. It looked decrepit and abandoned, and I turned the girl around and asked her if this was really her home. She smiled and said yes, very matter of fact. I was confused and a bit worried about the girl when suddenly I heard barking. Kaylee turned around and ran toward the sound. A golden retriever appeared and she yelled, "Macy!" before giving it a big hug. The girl thanked me for helping her, and it was nice meeting me. She began to walk off and I asked her to wait. She turned with a smile and she told me, "It's okay, my parents will meet me here shortly. They're at the store." Perplexed and concerned, I told her I'd wait here until they arrived. She told me she'd be fine and turned and walked toward the house. I tried to stop her, but to my shock, when she and her dog Macy hit the steps of the porch, they vanished. I remember stopping and jumping back a bit. I remember being very confused and very shaken. Then after a while, I walked up to the steps and went onto the porch. I called out for Kaylee or Macy, but I never received a response. I searched the house up and down and never saw any of them. Very shaken, I left. I began searching town records over the next few days to find anything I could on a Macy or a Kaylee. I found nothing at all about either of them. The family that lived in that farmhouse previously had no relation that I can tell to either of these two, and I was left with a very confused feeling. I've never seen either Kaylee or her dog, Macy, ever again. I'm convinced I met two ghosts, but Kaylee seemed so real up until the moment she vanished. And if they were ghosts,
I've never heard of ghosts haunting a place they had no previous connection to. What do you guys think?
I've been with the park rangers in Alaska for about 30 years. I'm getting ready to retire in a few months' time. Alaska is an amazingly beautiful state. In many ways, it is far different from the rest of the United States. There is a lot more wilderness and things that are still quite wild. Nature is much more prevalent and things are a lot more rural. If you've ever wanted to live in a place without a lot of neighbors, Alaska has plenty of places just for you. Anyway, my story starts in 1996. We got a call about a missing person. Now, we get the occasional missing person, and that's not unusual by any means, especially out in the wilds of Alaska. But this was a bit more pressing as the missing person wasn't an Alaskan resident. The person was a woman who was supposed to have come to visit some family. They were due out a week prior to return, but the family hadn't heard from her. I reassured the woman that there was a strong chance she was probably already back, but she hadn't checked in. Considering this was a younger woman, I thought maybe she was just enjoying her freedom, so to speak, as that wasn't very uncommon. Still, I told her we'd take things into consideration and we would look into things and let her know what we found. The first thing I did was head over and check in with the family this woman was supposed to be visiting. I was quite of the belief that the missing woman had already headed out of Alaska and gone back to New York where she lived, but I figured I should just check anyway, as if it were my kid, I want to know where their whereabouts were as well. It took some time to get where I was headed, as travel isn't always the most convenient out here in Alaska. Upon my arrival, I knocked on the door of this girl's aunt and explained the situation. I asked some simple questions, and it was then I grew a little bit more worried than I'd initially been. This girl's aunt was very welcoming and gracious, and while I was appreciative of this, she informed me quickly that she hadn't seen her niece since she left a week ago to go back home. I had a cup of coffee and thanked the woman before reassuring her I'd check in with the pilot who flew her out, and I'd get back to her. It wasn't long before I headed that way. While I was a bit more worried, I fully expected to hear from the pilot, and they'd flown her out to the nearest airport outside of Alaska. It was all okay. This theory was great and all except for one thing. Upon heading to where this pilot lived, I found something quite suspicious. A door covered in red. I'm not talking painted red. I'm talking a blood spray sort of red. I pounded on the door and announced myself several times, but I got no answer. I peeked around the residence and found what looked like to be more blood. I began following the trail, and there were points where I saw claw marks dug into the side of the cabin this pilot lived in. Eventually, I happened upon a broken window around the back. I took my flashlight and looked inside a bit and noticed there was blood absolutely everywhere. It was at this point I called the nearest authorities. I explained everything to them, and it was here the real investigation began. Inside the cabin was a horrid smell. The authorities had found bits and pieces of this pilot throughout the cabin. A head there, an arm here, blood and entrails just about everywhere. It was sickening, to say the least. It was possible the girl had been in the area, but it had been too long to know for sure. I decided to head back to the airstrip the pilot would have flown out from, and found almost nothing to authenticate what had happened, or if the girl had ever even been there. My initial thought was she had to have been there. Still, there wasn't much to go on, and the trail was fairly non-existent. Having nothing much to go on, I headed back to my own station and informed all the family members of the goings-ons. Mostly, we'd continue searching, and that it appeared that she was indeed missing. I obviously didn't let them know the details of the pilot or anything they didn't need to know. A day turned to a week, which was a month later, and we hadn't really found anything. There was nothing on what had happened to the girl or why the pilot had been mauled or by what. Most of the law enforcement seemed to assume it was a wild animal, but I didn't think as much.
I'd never seen a wild animal force its way into someone's home and then just proceed to eviscerate them completely. Sure, sometimes you'll get a wild animal that gets a little too wild, but the level of which the person has been massacred didn't make much sense. Also, it didn't seem like whatever mauled the pilot ate anything. The person was in pieces, sure, but if it were an animal, you'd think it would have feasted on some of it, if not all of it. Also, the claw marks were deep, and none of them seemed to match any kind of animal we had here in Alaska. The eeriest part of all this was that whatever attacked the pilot seemed to have done so with intelligence and almost cold calculation. There are plenty of smart animals out there, but the pilot was able to get their gun off to fire several shots in the process somehow. Whatever attacked him had somehow avoided these things. You'd have to be pretty fast to do something like that. I don't know a human or an animal that could avoid being shot at that close of range and get close enough to rip someone to pieces while that person is firing a shotgun right in front of them. Not a single part of this sat well with me, but there wasn't much I was able to do because I had little to nothing to go on. Looking back now, I wish this would have just been the end, honestly. I mean, no disrespect to the family or the girl or the pilot, but what happened next was more than I could have ever bargained for, if you catch my drift. I was home one night, about a couple of months after the investigation, when I heard a faint call for help. I was in my chair, fire going and doors locked. Because of the nature of the snow that was falling, I initially thought the wind was playing tricks on my mind, as it was storming pretty hard out there. This quickly changed upon the sound of a loud pounding on my door. I jumped, nearly spilling my hot cocoa all over myself, and I quickly shouted a few obscenities before grabbing my gun and asking who was there. I heard nothing in response, and I decided to check what could be out on the other side of that peephole. It was then I was shocked to see a blonde girl in her 20s covered in blood, crying outside my door. I quickly unlocked my door and swung it open, looking to help this girl, but upon opening the door, I saw no one. I was thrown off by this, especially when I shut the door, locked it again, took 2 steps before the pounding started again. I looked at the peephole again, but as I did, my power died for a moment. I felt shaky, and I couldn't see the best. I swore for a moment I heard the sound of faint sniffling and crying, but it was only for a second when the power came back on. This was normal, the blizzard being what it was. The thing that wasn't normal, however, was what happened next. I heard persistent knocking like something was blowing in the wind at my door. This was quite different from the pounding I had heard initially. Looking through the peephole, I saw a rope. Inside this rope was a bloody trash bag. I flipped out and called the police. The entire time I waited, I could hear the bag hitting the door. When law enforcement arrived, they found remains of a woman. It matched the idea of that missing woman that we were investigating. This poor girl had been torn to pieces. It looked like someone had ripped her spine out of her body and had a grand old time tearing the rest of her body piece by piece. This wasn't natural and it wasn't normal. I was shaken, to say the least. Something was out there and it left me this girl, which meant it knew where I lived and that I had looked into the disappearances. The next few nights I had were sleepless. Part of this was from the guilt of the way this girl was found, and part of this was from the horror of that same thing. What little sleep I did get came with nightmares and disturbing chantings inside my mind. I'd hear several minutes upon waking. In time, this slowly stopped. It was a year later before things got really strange again. I'd somewhat moved on from the previous year's events, as much as anyone could after something like that, when I got a call to the station. It was something crying and trying to speak, but it was breaking up quite a bit. After several attempts to calm this person down, the line died, abruptly. I decided to check around at the phone stations around the park and see if I could find anything. It was around the time I hit one of our most remote stations that I knew something was up. I found a blood-soaked handprint that seemed to streak. The phone line had been ripped out in the phone, and there was a trail of blood that led deeper into the woods. I called law enforcement and gave them my location before slowly making my way, gun in hand, down the blood-soaked snow trail. It wasn't long before I found myself face to face with a fresh body, or half of one, that is. A man was pinned to a tree by a branch that was driven through its mouth. His top half was... It was there, but where his bottom half should have been, there was only blood and some of his insides, which were steaming in the snow. It was here I stopped and waited for the authorities to arrive. I wasn't even slightly comfortable at this point, and I quite honestly wanted nothing to do with the continuing of this investigation. I didn't exactly have a choice, however, as this happened at my park and I was beginning to think it was done intentionally. Afraid for my life, I didn't dare move an inch till the police arrived. I told them everything I had found and what little I knew, and they eventually found the rest of the man a mile away. I went home and tried to sleep, but I didn't get much at all. I called in and took some time off, which was easy to do since I was the lead at the station. During my time off, I'd get strange nightly phone calls. The first time, it was the voice of the man who'd called me right before his death. I still get chills thinking about how the voice sounded exactly like the man. I swore it was his dying moments replayed again. The thing is though, an audio recording back then would have been obvious. This was no audio recording. It was either the dead man's ghost or something that mimicked his last moments perfectly. The second night I got a call, and it was just snickering on the other line. I threatened to call law enforcement and told whoever was on the other end of this line exactly what they could do to themselves if they catch my drift. Night 3 was several varying phone calls from 2 to 4 in the morning. They were all different and all on the hour. One was a woman crying. The 3 a.m. call was a child asking for his mother over and over again. And the final call of the night was a repeat of the man who'd been mauled at our park. I called the authorities, but they couldn't do much about it. The 4th night was an almost demonic or extremely warped voice. I couldn't understand it at all. And night 5 was someone whispering, "I see you," before hanging up. This call really unnerved me. The reason being was the strange wailing that came from outside my window after it happened. I peeked out the curtains and saw nothing, but I was uncomfortable the remainder of the night. I'd even taken to recording the calls so I could share them with law enforcement. Again, there was nothing they could really do about it. Night 6's call was an older woman begging for help and screaming at what sounded like her slowly being murdered, and night 7 was just heavy breathing. As tired as I was, I wanted to get back to somewhat of a normal routine after this, and went back to work the next morning. I was convinced at this point that something was stalking me. I thought it'd be the best to take advantage of this knowledge to set up traps of sorts, assuming I could catch whatever it was. I clocked out at the end of the workday and locked up. I then proceeded to wait at my station. I wasn't going to go home. I figured if something was stalking me, I'd meet it here, at my work. So, I loaded up my shotgun and my magnum and proceeded to wait. It was about 11ish when I heard a loud pounding at my station door. I asked who was there, and it was then I heard laughter from behind me. I looked and saw blood on the window. The shape looked like a 3-fingered hand. This was followed by a large thud on the roof above me. I cautiously sat down and waited. I wasn't looking to be baited out. I wouldn't need to be. However, as I heard a loud smack hit the station window, oh my god, it was a bloody trash bag that sat outside the window. This was followed by another which slammed the window again, and then another, and then another, and then another. And then, on the other side of the bloody handprint, I saw something that I'll never forget. Then, a final smack on the window. I saw a crack in the glass before hearing the loudest and most disturbing screaming I've ever heard in my life. I wish I had the words to describe it, but there is no way to describe what it was I heard. I tried my phone, keeping a close eye on the windows as I heard a slow scratching behind me on the outside of the station. Unfortunately for me, whatever was doing this killed the phone lines. The slow clawing made its way around the station and soon hit the window on the glass. I couldn't tell what it was in the darkness, but I I could see the marks it was making in the glass. I raised my shotgun, and the moment I did it, it stopped. Everything fell silent except for the snow and the wind that blew it. I heard a crashing sound behind me and spun around, firing off shots but finding nothing. It was as I was reloading that I heard the glass shatter behind me. Burst would be a better description, as it flew inwards as pieces of glass cut my skin. I fell to the ground and got up before firing a few more shots into the darkness. I heard nothing, and my adrenaline had me on edge as I was shaking. I wasn't shaking from the cold, I was shaking from pure fear. I heard a woman's laughter and then a man's crying. These sounds circled me and I kept an eye out. Whatever was there remained in the shadows. I was even more afraid now, as I wasn't sure where this thing was. Were the voices, the crying, all of it real, or was it something inside my mind? I knew whatever it was, this thing was creating it. I heard that same inhuman scream behind me, at which point I spun around and fired off every round I had left in my shotgun before immediately pulling my magnum out. There was a burst of disturbingly terrifying laughter that followed all of this. I've never heard anything so horrific in my entire lifetime. Things fell silent before a loud scream rang out ahead of me. I fired off a few shots and ran out the destroyed window in the direction of the screams. I didn't care if I died at this point. I just wanted it all to be over. I was sick of the sleepless nights and this thing toying with me, and so I fired as I ran until I heard clicking. I then reloaded as fast as my fingers would let me and shakily spun around in the snow, positive I was going to die at any moment. It was there I stood, shaking and crying until the sun came up. One of my coworkers arrived early for their shift and stood in shock at what they saw. They came to me and consoled me before driving out and finding a working phone. We called the police and I remember being in shambles. My mind was broken and I was afraid for my life. The worst part of it all was I never saw this thing. I gave the authorities my information and immediately took what I had in savings and moved away. My coworkers were able to help me find a transfer, and I now reside in California, where I'm getting ready to retire completely. Never found out what was going on, or what that thing was, or anything else in relation to it. I left the second I was able to, and I haven't been bothered by the thing since. Or whatever it was. I imagine it is native to Alaska. I have no clue what this thing was or how anyone is supposed to kill it, but I'm positive it is still out there somewhere, killing.
Thanks for listening to this compilation of creepy outdoor stories, voted in by viewers just like you. Again, if you would like to take part in future polls to vote in for your favorite topics to be made into compilations, be sure to follow me on Twitter at iSwampDweller. You can find the link to do that in the description down below. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, whether it's an outdoor story or something else, submit that at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. If you guys enjoyed these stories, please be sure to hit that like button, as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the swamp, why not join us and hit that subscribe button to never miss a new video. Turn on notifications to always be told when I upload. I upload videos almost every single day, on all things natural and supernatural. You can get merch such as Swamp Dweller face masks, shirts, and hoodies at teespring.com/swampdwellermerch. You can also find that link in the description. Thank you guys, as always, for supporting the swamp the way you do. If you want to listen to stories outside of YouTube on your everyday grind, you can do so by downloading Swamp Dweller Scary Stories on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and anywhere else you find scary stories online. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.